William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth was born in Cockermouth in West Cumberland, just on the northern fringe of the English Lake District. When his mother died, the 8-year-old boy was sent to school at Hawkshead, near Eastwaite Lake, in the heart of that sparsely populated region that he and Coleridge were to transform into one of the poetic centers of England. William and his 3 brothers boarded in the cottage of Anne Tyson, who gave the boy simple comfort, ample affection, and freedom to roam the countryside at will. A vigorous, unruly, and sometimes moody boy, William spent his free days and occasionally half the night in the sports and rambles described in the first 2 books of the Prelude, drinking in, to use one of his favorite metaphors, the natural sights and sounds, and getting to know the cottagers, shepherds, and solitary wanderers who moved through his imagination into his later poetry. He also found time to read voraciously in the books owned by his young headmaster, William Taylor, who encouraged him in his inclination to poetry. John Wordsworth, the poet's father, died suddenly when William was 13, leaving to his 5 children mainly the substantial sum owed him by Lord Lonsdale, whom he had served as attorney and as steward of the huge Lonsdale estate. This harsh nobleman had yet to pay the debt when he died in 1802. Wordsworth was nevertheless able in 1787 to enter St. John's College, Cambridge University, where 4 years later he took his degree without distinction. During the summer vacation of his 3rd year at Cambridge, 1790, Wordsworth and his closest college friend, the Welshman Robert Jones, journeyed on foot through France and the Alps, described in the Prelude 6, at the time when the French were joyously celebrating the first anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. Upon completing his course at Cambridge, Wordsworth spent 4 months in London, set off on another walking tour with Robert Jones through Wales, the time of the memorable ascent of Mount Snowdon in the Prelude 14, and then went back alone to France to master the language and qualify as a traveling tutor. During his year in France, November 1791 to December 1792, Wordsworth became a fervent supporter of the French Revolution, which seemed to him and many others to promise a glorious renovation of society, and he fell in love with Annette Vallon, the daughter of a French surgeon at Blois. The two planned to marry, despite their differences in religion and political inclinations. Annette belonged to an old Catholic family, whose sympathies were royalist. But almost immediately after their daughter, Caroline, was born, lack of money forced Wordsworth to return to England. The outbreak of war made it impossible for him to rejoin Annette and Caroline. Wordsworth's guilt over this abandonment, his divided loyalties between England and France, and his gradual disillusion with the course of the Revolution brought him, according to his account in the Prelude 10 and 11, to the verge of an emotional breakdown. When sick, wearied out with contrarieties, he yielded up moral questions in despair. His suffering, his near collapse, and the successful effort, after his break with his past, to re-establish a saving intercourse with my true self, are the experiences that underlie many of his greatest poems. At this critical point, a friend died and left Wordsworth a sum of money just sufficient to enable him to live by his poetry. In 1795, he settled in a rent-free house at Racedown, Dorsetshire, with his beloved sister, Dorothy, who now began her long career as confidant, inspirer, and secretary. At that same time, Wordsworth met Samuel Taylor Coleridge. 2 years later, he moved to Alfoxden House, Somersetshire, to be near Coleridge, who lived 4 miles away at Nether Stowey. Here he entered at the age of 27, on the delayed springtime of his poetic career. Even while he had been an undergraduate at Cambridge, Coleridge claimed that he had detected signs of genius in Wordsworth's rather conventional poem about his tour in the Alps, Descriptive Sketches, published in 1793. Now he hailed Wordsworth unreservedly as the best poet of the age. The two men met almost daily, talked for hours about poetry, and wrote prolifically. So close was their association that we find the same phrases occurring in poems by Wordsworth and Coleridge, as well as in the remarkable journals that Dorothy kept at the time. The two poets collaborated in some writings and freely traded thoughts and passages for others, and Coleridge even undertook to complete a few poems that Wordsworth had left unfinished. This close partnership, along with the hospitality the two households offered to another young radical writer, John Thewell, aroused the paranoia of people in the neighborhood. Already fearful of a military invasion by France, they became convinced that Wordsworth and Coleridge were political plotters, not poets. The government sent spies to investigate, and the Wordsworths lost their lease. Although brought to this abrupt end, that short period of collaboration resulted in one of the most important books of the era, Lyrical Ballads, with a few other poems, published anonymously in 1798. This short volume opened with Coleridge's Ancient Mariner and included 3 other poems by Coleridge, some lyrics in which Wordsworth celebrated the experience of nature, and a number of verse anecdotes drawn from the lives of the rural poor. The verse forms and the subject matter of this last set of poems, which include Simon Lee, We Are Seven, and The Thorn, make evident the debt announced in the very title of Lyrical Ballads, that Wordsworth's and Coleridge's book owed to the folk ballads that were being transcribed and anthologized in the later 18th century, later 1700s, by collectors such as Thomas Percy and Robert Burns. The book closed with Wordsworth's great descriptive and meditative poem in blank verse, Tintern Abbey. This poem inaugurated what modern critics call Wordsworth's myth of nature, his presentation of the growth of his mind to maturity, a process unfolding through the interaction between the inner world of the mind and the shaping force of external nature. William Hazlitt said that when he heard Coleridge read some of the newly written poems of Lyrical Ballads aloud, the sense of a new style and a new spirit in poetry came over me, with something of the effect that arises from the turning up of the fresh soil, or of the first welcome breath of spring. The reviewers were less enthusiastic, warning that, because of their simple language and subject matter, poems such as Simon Lee risked vulgarity or silliness. Nevertheless, Lyrical Ballads sold out in 2 years, and Wordsworth published under his own name a new edition, dated 1800, to which he added a second volume of poems. In his famous preface to this edition, planned in close consultation with Coleridge, Wordsworth outlined a critical program that provided a retroactive rationale for the experiments the poems represented. Late in 1799, William and Dorothy moved back permanently to their native lakes, settling at Grasmere in the little house later named Dove Cottage. Coleridge, following them, rented at Keswick, 13 miles away. In 1802, Wordsworth finally came into his father's inheritance and, after an amicable settlement with Annette Fellon, married Mary Hutchinson, whom he had known since childhood. His life after that time had many sorrows. The drowning in 1805 of his favorite brother John, a sea captain. The death in 1812 of 2 of his and Mary's 5 children. A growing rift with Coleridge, culminating in a bitter quarrel, 1810, from which they were not completely reconciled for almost 2 decades. And from the 1830s on, Dorothy's physical and mental illness. Over these years, Wordsworth became, nonetheless, increasingly prosperous and famous. He also displayed a political and religious conservatism that disappointed readers who, like Hazlitt, had interpreted his early work as the expression of a leveling muse that promoted democratic change. In 1813, a government sinecure, the position of stamp distributor, that is, revenue collector, for Westmoreland, was bestowed on him, concrete evidence of his recognition as a national poet and of the alteration in the government's perception of his politics. Gradually, Wordsworth's residences, as he moved into more and more comfortable quarters, became standard stops for sightseers touring the lakes. By 1843, he was Poet Laureate of Great Britain. He died in 1850 at the age of 80. Only then did his executors publish his masterpiece, The Prelude, the autobiographical poem that he had written in 2 parts in 1799, expanded to its full length in 1805, and then continued to revise almost to the last decade of his long life. Most of Wordsworth's greatest poetry had been written by 1807, when he published poems in 2 volumes, and after The Excursion, 1814, and the first collected edition of his poems, 1815. Although he continued to write prolifically, his powers appeared to decline. The causes of that decline have been much debated. One seems to be inherent in the very nature of his writing. Wordsworth is above all the poet of the remembrance of things past, or, as he put it, of emotion recollected in tranquility. Some object or event in the present triggers a sudden renewal of feelings he had experienced in youth. The result is a poem exhibiting the discrepancy between what Wordsworth called 2 consciousnesses, himself as he is now, and himself as he once was. But the memory of one's early emotional experience is not an inexhaustible resource for poetry, as Wordsworth recognized. He said in Prelude 12, while describing the recurrence of spots of time from his memories of childhood, The days gone by return upon me, almost from the dawn of life. The hiding places of man's power open. I would approach them, but they close. I see by glimpses now, when age comes on, may scarcely see at all. The past that Wordsworth recollected was one of moments of intense experience, and of emotional turmoil that is ordered, in the calmer present, into a hard-won equilibrium. As time went on, however, he gained what, in the Ode to Duty, composed in 1804, he longed for, a repose which ever is the same, but at the expense of the agony and excitation that, under the calm surface, empower his best and most characteristic poems. Occasionally in his middle and later life, a jolting experience would revive the intensity of Wordsworth's remembered emotion, and also his earlier poetic strength. The moving sonnet Surprised by Joy, for example, was written in his 40s at the abrupt realization that time was beginning to diminish his grief at the death some years earlier of his little daughter Catherine. And when Wordsworth was 65 years old, the sudden report of the death of James Hogg called up the memory of other poets whom Wordsworth had loved and outlived. The result was his extempore effusion, in which he returns to the simple quatrains of the early lyrical ballads, and recovers the elegiac voice that had mourned Lucy 35 years before.